Dr. Treitz oversees the Marine Mammal Research Unit at UBC and a research program that involves captive and field studies of seals, sea lions, whales, and dolphins. His research is primarily focused on pinnipeds, stellar sea lions, northern fur seals, and harbor seals. Dr. Treitz earned a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Ecology at McGill University and Master's and PhD's degrees in Zoology at the University of British Columbia. Thank you for listening to this update on PSF, and please now join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Treitz.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for being here today to hear a little bit more about seals, sea lions, and killer whales. A lot of what I have to talk to you about really starts with funding that came from PSF for the Salish Sea Marine Survival Program. Before we got into this, we had not fully appreciated the impact that seals were having on salmon stocks. It was really unexpected what we discovered. At the same time, we've gotten now embroiled into killer whales as well, and I'm very pleased that the Salmon Foundation has come in as a partner on a research proposal that's being considered now by NSERC and DFO to look into more about the behavior and the abundance of Chinook relative to killer whales. Before we get into our discussion today, I want to give you a little bit of context because so much has to do with the numbers of seals we have today compared to what was once here in the past and what we would like to see for the future. So I want to look at a couple things. One is how many were there? And second, how do we get here? If I had been speaking to you 3 years ago, we would not be talking about killer whales. It would have only been about the seals. On this graph, and I realize it's hard to see at the back of the room, but it starts from 1960 out to present day. And if I was to ask you how many killer whales are left in the population, I bet almost every single person could tell me there are just 74. That is repeated like a mantra over and over. And yet if I was to ask you, well, how many should there be? How many were there? I bet nobody's seen the data. It's not shown. I'm going to show you the data. It seems like it's been a top kept secret, but it's publicly available. If you go back in time, and when I ask friends, they'll say, well, I think there should be maybe 1,000, maybe 500. I don't know. How many were there? Here we go, going back in time. We go back to 1960. And what you see on here is periods of going up and periods of going down. Some people will report they've been declining for 20 years, and they're fitting a curve a bit like this, from the highest point out to present. But if I was to show the data, I could also say, but they've been increasing for 45 years. It's all about how you want to creatively fit the data. The reality is that neither of these are the right way to fit the data. If you're going to be honest with people, you would point out that they've declined 4 times in the past 57 years. This first decline, we understand, that was caused by removal for the aquarium industry. They were taken to aquariums all over the world, including here to Vancouver, but they recovered after that. There's a decline, we don't know why. Their peak was 98. In fact, we know based on the genetics that they've never numbered more than 100 for over a century. And now we're down here at 74, the most recent decline. So here's what's interesting. Here we are at 74, and I ask people, well, they don't know how many we want. So I said, well, maybe would you like the number we had in 1960, before we had oil tankers, before we talked about a pipeline, before we talked about overfishing? Oh yeah, that would be good. Well, 1960, there were 78. Well, this can't be the right data. This is the data, and yet we don't talk about this. So when we talk about recovery, what do we want them to recover to? Back to 1960? Or back to the all-time high ever recorded of 98? Or do we want the long-term average? So how do we get here? I was asked this. We ran some workshops in the spring with groups of sport fishing guides as we're getting their insight into assessing the abundance of Chinook. And one of them asked me the question, how do we get here? And I didn't know. So I thought, well, one way to do this is to search for all the media stories ever written about southern resident killer whales. The first story we found was published in 1992, and we took it up to April 2018. And here's the graph in terms of numbers of media stories with the word southern resident killer whale. you can see it's been an exponential rise. And a couple of quick facts, there were just over 2,000 articles, 50% of newspapers. The #1 newspaper that reports on it is the Times Colonist in Victoria. 60% of the articles are out only in the last 4 years. 50% of articles are coming from BC. The US only has 10%. And so the US has not been that interested until just recently. And 10% have been positive, 90% split between neutral and negative. So let's do one more search with this to figure out what happened. So I did these word clouds. So I looked for the frequently used words in headlines and leads about southern resident killer whales since 1992. If you do it by year, this takes us from 1992 up to 2015. The big words in here, essentially orca, whale, baby, new, and endangered when they were listed as endangered. Every year looked almost the same until we get to 2016, and this is when the dial got changed. It's not round, it's square. And if you could read this, you would find words like trans, mountain, pipeline, noise. They became the poster child in a campaign after humpback whales were delisted. It was focused on humpback whales until this. This became the poster child. Everything was on the table. And now we've settled down into the keywords are still about noise, shipping, oil, pipeline. This is what's been driving it, and now we have salmon and fishing mixed into it, into the discussion as well. Let me give you a quick view here of stellar sea lions so you understand the numbers. They range throughout the North Pacific from California over to northern Japan. And we have two populations. One called the eastern, which is part of British Columbia's population, but everything in the west has declined since the late 1970s. And over here, they've been increasing. So those who've been seeing increasing populations are right, but I'm just going to show you quickly here. This is what happened to sea lions in Alaska. Starting, the first counts in the mid-50s, they were increasing. They peaked at about 275,000 in the early 70s, and they began this roller coaster dive where some feared they're going to extinction. They were listed as threatened, and they were listed as endangered. They hit an inflection point, 1989, another one, 1999, and they've been slowly recovering. This is not to do with fishing. It is not to do with culling or hunting. It has to do with the natural change in the ecosystem. So my point here is the marine mammals go up and they go down independent of what anybody might be doing to them. And we have our eastern population, which showed a decline while the Alaskan one was increasing, and they now number more than all the Alaska population together. And on this scale, it doesn't look like too much, but if I was to change the scale, this is how that same data looks, and this may fit more your perceptions of what you're seeing more recently in terms of there are just more and more sea lions. They are indeed increasing. But when you look at British Columbia, and these are our numbers here. So this is the most recent counts, so coming from the 60s out to present, they are indeed growing exponentially. They've not stopped growing. They've not hit their carrying capacity. But if you go back in time, trying to understand what was normal, this is what the past was. So they're getting almost back to where they once were. They declined in part because of culling, but there is also the reverse effect of what happened in Alaska, a change in the ecosystem that changed the ability of it to support sea lions. California sea lions, again, people hear them more and more frequently, that incessant barking sound. They breed in California and Mexico. And Mexico, they've just been holding their own. They're declining there as the ocean has got less oxygen. It's not supporting as many fish. But in the US, they're still increasing. They may be close to carrying capacity, but still going up. But it is the males that are coming to BC. We're seeing males, the females with pups stay south. It's only the males that are coming. And probably with climate change, more are going to be coming here. So then finally, the harbor seals, their numbers, and we can reconstruct it back a little bit further. We saw a decline here largely in the late 40s due to culling, and they're also hunted and culled prior to that. And they increased exponentially, but they've been stable for about 18 years now. And they're at a stable numbers with little change. We have overall about 100,000 in BC, about 40,000 in the Strait of Georgia. And that's all I've got to say. We're now going to go into, I think, a discussion. And maybe Brian will say a little bit more on Chinook, and then we can dig into some of the issues.
The status of Chinook is quite variable, but right now, the principal stocks that would contribute to the southern resident orcas are in a depressed production level. And what's different now is that there's a very widespread reduction. Whereas in the past, we had a lot of variability in the stocks that are down, the stocks that are up. And so really, it kind of buffered any one population. So we're seeing a net effect now where the productivity across many populations is depressed. And I have been trying to get people to focus that there are two principal stocks of Chinook in southern BC that are probably critical to the topic of the southern residents. One of them is the South Thompson Chinook, is a summer run timing fish that comes in when the whales are showing up through the summer and that. And it went from a very low level of production previous to the Salmon Treaty in '85. And then it grew to be the largest Chinook production, or the largest population of Chinook in Canada. And that. So we got up to populations that are 250 to 300,000 Chinook in one section of a river. So they reduced recently to something that's probably around 100,000, which still sounds very good, but it's down from what was being done about 10 years ago. The critical population is actually very local. It's the Harrison white Chinook, and that population was for a long time our biggest population ever. And the productivity there is very depressed right now. And so the combination of those two, so the summer timing Chinook in July, August, and the fall Chinook coming in August, September, that has a significant net reduction, probably well below 50% of the available return. But don't forget about the US stocks, right? That's another entire story.
Well, so as you're mentioning that, is it predators that are the main issue, or do we go back to habitat preservation and a variety of other factors that are happening in the Salish Sea?
Well, the Salish Sea Marine Survival Program is showing that it's a net effect of many factors. It is habitat, it is predators, it's the overall, what we call marine survival, right? And the marine survival is, of course, a very broad type of term that people use for all factors. But we're even finding out that unless you're very careful what you call marine, a lot of the mortality on very small Chinook is actually in fresh water. And so the provincial legislation requiring us to have ecological flows in the rivers, which is still not implemented, is a critical factor in the future. So if you don't have sufficient flow, then what we saw in the Cowichan in 2015 was the fish that were released from the hatchery, 75% of them didn't make it to the estuary. 75% were taken in fresh water or were stranded in fresh water, because some die by simply being stranded in side channels. But the blue herons and all sorts of other animals were actually feeding when the flow was extremely low.
So Andrew, a question is, with the southern resident killer whale population, we're seeing decline in Chinook salmon. Why don't they turn to other food sources? Their cousins on the west coast of Vancouver Island do, don't they?
Well, and this has been puzzling to, not just biologists, but all the public as well. Like, how could a species just focus on a single item? Well, they don't eat only Chinook, but that is their bread and butter. And the explanation seems to be because that fish is available year-round, unlike sockeye, for example. And so they can count on it. Yes, they get them when they're returning, but they also get the ones that are out feeding in the coastal areas as well. Something, though, that a lot of people don't think much about is that we've got two populations of Chinook-loving whales. There's the southerns, which are in decline at the moment, but we have the northern residents. The northern residents, they number now over 300. They're still increasing, and yet they also feed on BC Chinook salmon. They're intercepting some salmon also headed further south. In fact, the population or the clan within the northern residents that is growing the fastest is the ones that shares habitat with the southern residents. So we have this perception by people say, well, they're starving. Well, no, the southerns are not starving. There were a couple individuals that were emaciated, but I can guarantee if I took you into the cancer ward of a hospital, your first reaction in seeing somebody who's not is, there's a food shortage in this hospital. Why aren't they feeding this poor person? This person is starving. So for a veterinarian or pathologist, we look at animals like that as having disease, secondary problems, but most people never see wildlife like this that is in this sort of condition, because if it was a fish or a bird, perhaps it would be eaten, but a top predator you get to see. But the contradiction is that the southern residents are an outlier. Our other populations of marine mammals are doing extremely well. Other populations of killer whales are doing extremely well. And we also look at this southern resident population as though it is a made in BC problem. The reality is that this is the northern limit of the range. They're competing with the growing populations to the north, and their full range goes down to California. There's no discussion about what happened to the food they depend on in the wintertime in California and Oregon. What happened to the Sacramento River? What's happened to the Columbia and the stocks that used to support? There used to be winter runs in the Sacramento. The population doesn't have the food it needs when it's away from BC for about 10 months of the year. And yet it's presented as a made in BC problem in isolation or without the context of other populations and what it requires in the full range.
So Brian, now that there is this focus on the southern resident killer whale population, are you finding it easier to get people to pay attention to what's happening within the Salish Sea and the research that you're doing?
Ask them. I think definitely. People are more aware of how the problems are all interrelated. For example, I was just talking to a group this morning working on a really, really important science program called EPIC. And all it is about using genomics to study hatcheries we spend a ton of tax dollars on and are highly ineffective, right? Well, we now have the capabilities to go in and try and understand what is causing the poor productivity of hatchery fish that we could depend on right now. And that hasn't been done, so that can be done.
So what
about
learning?
coho salmon?
What are you learning right at the moment?
Well, there's a lot that we have speculated on for years that turned out to be completely correct. There are significant genetic changes in the hatchery production, and putting large numbers of fish out in a confined time space does increase competition for food in the Strait of Georgia. And you really look at the overall effect of BC plus Puget Sound. BC is a relatively small component. Puget Sound is huge compared to us. And all of those hatchery fish are really put out in about 2 weeks, right? And so you've got this really glut of fish going out that will attract predators, it will compete with wild fish. And so you're really probably enhancing the problems we have for wild productivity. Habitat is the other side, but the habitat hasn't just changed overnight. That's a progressive problem that, in all honesty, I think we've realized that we have to do a better job, and people are now talking about more restoration than they are about depleting habitats.
So a question for both of you from slightly different perspectives. Occasionally you hear somebody say, well, why don't we just put a moratorium on especially Chinook salmon fishing? Would that benefit the Chinook population? And would it provide a benefit to the southern resident killer whale population? Andrew.
Maybe I'll start. So in terms of the question, so how many Chinook do southern resident killer whales need? I was on an international panel sponsored by DFO and National Marine Fisheries Service, and our conclusion, we're all academics, was that there are about 600,000 Chinook returning into Juan de Fuca Strait. We could find no evidence that the abundance was insufficient to support the whale population. Last fall, I ran a workshop for DFO and NIMPS, and again, the scientific consensus was that shutting down fishing would not add more fish for killer whales. The question we did have is about whether or not vessels could disrupt the ability of killer whales to capture fish. But in terms of numbers, the consensus was that shutting fishing down, and a report's available, it was given to DFO. I'm not sure that the recommendations were considered, but that was the consensus. So it doesn't appear to be that shutting down, reducing the Chinook catch would directly benefit killer whales. It may well result in more fish spawning, and that's for Brian to address.
Well, obviously, if you stop fishing and the fish are not picked up by the orcas, then you will increase the escapement. So if the productivity is there in the subsequent generation, then the population should build. Unfortunately, we have substantially reduced the exploitation in the ocean. Under the Salmon Treaty and through domestic actions, there are probably not many Chinook populations that have an exploitation rate that's over 25 or 30%, maybe up to 35% in total. All right, so it's not what it was. I mean, in the years where we were saying in probably the mid 80s, we had exploitation rates that were 75 to 85%. All right, so those were extraordinary values that nobody really would have guessed at. But it's all based on the codaware tags, and when people criticize it and really took a look at it, it was right. I mean, you can conservatively say at least 75% of the fish were being harvested in Chinook salmon. That's not sustainable even by the hatcheries. All right, so now that is not the case today. And so if you substantially reduce fisheries further, you're going to get a relatively small benefit, right? So you're not going to take it to zero in that sense that you're going to have additional hatch mortality. But I mean, the big effect would be if there's that many fish coming back, what is the limiting factor to their feeding? Is it availability of the Chinook? Is it all compressed in run timing? So you could talk about a big number, but they're not there all the time. They're in runs. That's why I was pointing out there are certain stocks of higher priority because they are in the feeding area in the right time and we know they're available. All right, so those are the populations you have to focus on if you really want to have a short-term effect. It's not every Chinook population everywhere that where if you shut everything down to zero.
So then how do we focus on those short runs and help to enhance their survival? What are the key elements of that program?
Well, I think that's really what the recreational sector was trying to tell the department. It's more about time and area closure. It's much more strategic than using a big blunt hammer and just saying stop everything. The impact of stopping everything is simply a huge effect on coastal communities that are highly reliant on recreational fishing these days. I mean, you don't have the logging intensity, and you have marinas and you have recreational boating and you have fishing. But you don't need to shut the entire coast. There are huge areas of the coast to get these sort of effects. So I think we really have to have a better dialogue in terms of time and area. And I know from talking with people because of being in the Salmon Treaty discussions, that has been presented, but it's not really been listened to effectively. We are now getting to a point where, I mean, what we're trying to do together, so the research program we're talking about, there are new technologies where we can look at the feeding effect of orcas on tagged Chinook salmon. So we can actually now directly measure what is the need to get Chinook into an area and where are they actively feeding, right?
And time it for the arrival of the southern resident population when they come north.
But
Is
you
that-
know,
is
I think
that
there's very
possible?
few people that understand just how complex the biology is of Chinook salmon. I'd say even the biologists study killer whales, they just think there's only one fish called Chinook. They don't understand the difference between spring Chinook and fall Chinook, what fish are available, the difference in timings, and the public certainly doesn't understand anything at all. And so part of the battle
come
is
now.
making people, okay,
Anything. We're talking fishing here.
fishing, but I'd say outside of the fishing community, I'd be surprised how many people, if you said, spring and fall, they say, well, that's the same fish, right? It just, somebody calls it a spring, but they're just like different names. It's like calling king salmon. It's just the same thing, right? And I've been surprised since I've dug deep into this, how the killer whale biology community has a very poor understanding of Chinook. And I think it's one area where if you're going to be doing closures, it is about timing. The size of the fish is different depending on the runs. And these are things that I hadn't appreciated until I was put onto these panels to start educating myself about Chinook.
Actually, the size of Chinook is an interesting point too, because many of the rec sector people here will tell you that the condition of Chinook salmon is declining over time. It's not just the survival, but we're seeing smaller fish at age, right? And the Chinook salmon that we see, and we have to sample scales and scats and this sort of thing, you'll see that there's a preference for larger Chinook salmon when you actually look at the scat coming from the whales. And it's not all that surprising if it's a solitary animal that they're feeding on because of echolocation. The bigger fish have a bigger target. The bigger fish are typically females. Some runs to the extent that the older large fish is 75% of the time will be female. So you get a higher energy content because they're carrying the eggs, right? I mean, these are very selective animals. And so the loss of body condition in Chinook salmon could be just as much of the story as the numbers.
From what you're saying, though, I hear that we can have a positive impact on Chinook. through a number of the programs that we have developed. Can we have the same positive impact in helping to adjust behaviors or change appetites with killer whales? Like, I don't know that we can move into that population and have direct impact, or can we?
It's not clear that we can. I mean, part of this would be understanding, so each week is different. Which run is coming in, what fish are available, where are the whales, how are they finding food? We're at UBC involved in research trying to better understand the movements and numbers of fish and where they're available, but we're just at the start of it. But I think even when we have all the information, it's not clear to me that we could manage in real time to affect the abundance or make the availability greater for the killer whales. But we will be getting closer to being able to evaluate more quantitatively if there are enough fish for the whales.
But the run timing of Chinook salmon is not that variable. So run timing can have a huge effect on, not even stock. The true run timing for a single stock is incredibly repeatable. And that it's something that people really don't understand. But from year to year, with large environmental variations, you do not see a comparable variation in run timing. They're very, very close. I mean, you're probably talking a variation of plus or minus maybe a week, right? So you don't need to manage to days or a week, right? So you could really set for a particular populations of interest, you could target your restoration on those populations, and you can be very, very confident that they're going to be running through an area in about a 2-week period, right? Now, they hold in some areas, and that's where we were going to try and focus some of our information recovery, because every recreational fisherman will tell you has a favorite place, and there's some place where the Chinook hold and they mill, and they do. But they'll hold or they're going to mill for 4 or 5 days, and they're going to constantly be mixing and moving on. But that's where the orcas know to feed as well.
Right, but we can have some habitat impact, and we can enhance those habitat, help to ensure a higher survival rate, can we not?
Well, the habitat work can definitely be targeted, but of course it's longer term, just by its very nature. All right, you're going to save the habitat in the lower Fraser or in the mid Fraser, where you're going to be able to increase survival of the downstream smolts, but you're not going to see those big fish back for 4 or 5 years. All right, so this is a long-term investment, but that has to be done.
Well, that has to be our view anyways, doesn't it? You know, Andrew, when I was looking at your chart about the population of the southern resident whale population, where we're at now, what's the mix between male and females? Because if we want to see an increase in the population, there has to be a healthy female population that can bear calves.
Yeah, no, and well, when you look at the long-term total numbers, we look to be within the range of the long-term average. But what the numbers do hide is the sex ratio and age structure. And one of the problems this population has had is that they're giving birth to primarily males. And so the sex ratio is skewed towards having sons, and the future of any population that has too many males is not good. They need more females. Also, some of those females are older and not reproductive, so the effective population is very small. I think it's around 23, if I remember correctly. And so the future for the population is bleak. There's no hiding that. And whether or not the skewed up sex ratio is simply a function of bad luck or something else, nobody knows. But its future is not good. At the same time, you know, there's concern, well, what happens if this population goes extinct? And there is a good chance that this will happen. Due largely, I think, to what's happened in California, and Oregon, due to the fact of climate change, not being able to support it, and also due to the fact that the northern residents are increasing. They need more habitat. These two populations, they're not kissing cousins. They don't hang out together, they avoid each other, and I'm expecting that the northerns will start to take over more of the territory, pushing south, and if the southerns do go, they will be replaced by the northerns. They need more territory. They've got to stop growing at some point, but at this point, they're still growing year after year.
So the federal government, of course, has just announced that they're putting over $60 million into looking into the current situation with the southern resident killer whales. Is this money well spent?
Well, you'd have to know how they plan to spend it. I think that's the secret of the
Well,
day.
if the objective is to try and, to save this population, and as Andrew just pointed out, they may go extinct, are we putting money where we can actually, provide value and help this population to survive?
Well, the money is obviously for specific activities. I just don't know what those activities are at this time. I know that there was an allocation for research. What are we competing for, $3 million? So $61 million they announced it. Within that is a $3 million pot that might actually help us really understand the interaction between Chinook and Orcas, which I think should be top of the pile. But that's $3 million out of $61 million. And we don't have any idea if we're going to get that, right? Because there will be many people competing for that money, right? I would take a far more directed action and say, what don't we know to be effective in investing this money, and who should do that work? This is the fundamental difference that PSF undertook when we designed the Sailor Sea program. What we wanted to do is we were not going to do an open competition. We went and got the people we knew would deliver the goods, and we paid them to do it. So we went to Andrew and said, we need to understand seals. And he came up with some of the most original work that we've ever seen. That's where we got the pit tags and the seal beanies that became such a popular picture. But that was the first time in history where you had a direct measure of predation of harbor seals on, and those were tagged coho salmon, right? So, I mean, you can do things now with technology that we just dreamt about 10 years ago. So we could address this much more directly than just saying, here's a bunch of money. And I honestly do not know where it's all being allocated. Right. But that's 61 million out of a total, that's still going to be 1.1 billion under OPP over 5 years. That's a massive investment, so we should be able to do something directed with it.
And while the money may not save whales, we're certainly learning a huge amount about the biology, the ecosystem. We're going to learn a lot more about Chinook than we ever knew before. So it is an investment in the future, but it may not save the whales. Mm-hmm. So the dividing line for the whales, it's roughly southern Vancouver Island. There's overlap. So the southern residents go from, let's say, from California, southern California, up maybe as far as northern Vancouver Island. And the northerns will be going from southern Vancouver Island up to the Alaska border. So they have their traditional territories. There is overlap and also potential for competition in those overlapping areas. The point is that in BC, both populations depend on Chinook. One is doing extremely well, and the other one is just barely holding on.
So does the northern resident whale population also eat sea lions and harbor seals?
So the northern residents are also salmon specialists, and while they prefer Chinook, we know they also eat a lot of chum in the fall. We're getting reports of them eating sockeye this year. We got reports coming in, and this is the other good thing is that people are now taking pictures. So we get pictures of them eating black cod. And so the narrative about their diet is expanding, although we can't refute the fact that they prefer one species over the others. But their diet is more diverse than has generally been discussed before. This other population are the transient killer whales. And the transients are the ones that specialize in eating other marine mammals. So their number one prey item are harbor seals. They also eat harbor porpoise. They take Steller sea lions and California sea lions. They too are increasing. They are the most polluted animal on the planet, but it isn't hurting their ability to keep growing. And so they are increasing. They're culling the seals. They're keeping the seal population stable. They haven't put a dent into the sea lions yet, but I expect as they keep growing, they too will affect their numbers. The other interesting thing is that, you know, it used to be that we didn't see transient killer whales all that often in the Salish Sea. Now we see them every single day. Every day they're here. That wasn't the case about 15 years ago. And so that correlates with the stopping of the growth of the seals here. And this has been one of the concerns. There are individuals and groups that want to see the seal population reduced by half as soon as possible. A proposal has been submitted to DFO to do that. Well, one of the outcomes, if that was to go ahead, is we're now going to need a recovery plan to save transient killer whales. What are they going to eat? You're going to remove half their food. And so by trying to fix one thing, you may end up causing a bigger problem. And I can just wait for the world to respond to the fact that now we have starving killer whales because they're being culled. And yes, that may result in more Chinook salmon, which may benefit the southern residents, or maybe there's already enough for the southern residents. They're not limited by that. It's complex, but we're living in a complex time.
You want to add anything to that, Brian?
It's called ecosystem-based management. Everything eats everything. Well, I mean, First Nations have talked about this for centuries, right? Everything's connected. And that, so I know the only radio interview I've done on the cull is that culls are not something simple. You don't just go out and do it once. We've learned that lesson a number of times. This would be an ongoing regulatory program, and it would be something you'd have to do very carefully, and you'd have to monitor whether you have any net effect at all, because these seals are surprisingly productive. So we've had the transients coming in for a number of years. We had really hoped to see a decline in the seal population to avoid a big discussion about culls. I mean, as Andrew has just said, with all the transients coming in every day, all you've done is stabilize the seal population around 40, 45,000. And they've been there for 20 years. And
So the transients are coming and going in our waters year-round, whereas the southern resident whale population is only here for 2.5 months out of the year. So to carry on with Mr. Bradshaw's question, where exactly do we see the transient population? What's the area that they will live in?
Their range is much further. So they're going from Southern California up into Southeast Alaska. And then there's another transient population up in Prince William Sound, and another one's going out through the Aleutians. So they've got a much bigger range, and they're responding to the fact that marine mammals were protected following the culls in Canada and the United States. And so their growth is really mirroring the recovery of these populations. One other interesting point for the harbor seal numbers is that when you look back in the 1800s, so before there was a cull, First Nations hunted them, and probably hunted them at a level that kept the population at about half of what it is today. And so one could say, well, that is the natural population level under sustained human hunting. But if you go back further in time, before the First Nations were here, there were seals and there were salmon, and they co-evolved to survive together. And the question is whether or not we're going back to that day, sort of the pre-contact days, or what it is that we want. And I think that society in British Columbia is going to have a very open and probably heated discussion, and the time is right to figure out what is it that we want. Do you want to go out and see a seal, or do you want to go out and see a seal flee for its life? Because it hears a boat coming towards it. We live in one of the most amazing places in the world. This ecosystem overall is really healthy. We have this strong outlier with the southern residents. We also know that there are things in the ocean that go beyond the control of what humans can do. I showed that with the stellar sea lions that declined in Alaska. And when the ecosystem shifts, we're going to see a change there as well. We don't understand the extent to which that also drives salmon abundance, but it is inevitably intertwined with that.
So we have a question out. Somebody, we'll bring a microphone down to you. Just while we're waiting for that question to be asked, Andrew, you said that the southern resident whale population may look like they're starving compared to their cousins, the transient and northern.
So maybe what I should clarify. So on average, they are thinner than the northern residents. And so using drones, it's possible to measure body width, body length, and get an estimate of body condition. So they are thinner. It doesn't mean that they are malnourished, but it suggests that they are not getting enough. The two animals that made the headlines were starving, but it isn't clear that, remember, this is a species where they share food. It isn't as though they're going to say, Uncle John, we're not going to feed you today. They share food, so it doesn't make any sense where we've got a case where you'd have one or two being ignored by the others. They share food. If they're not eating, it's reflecting the fact that there's something physically wrong with them. And I've certainly see that with sea lions that have cancers. Killer whales are no different. So there are a few things. So a lot of people focus on Victoria and how they haven't treated sewage. But that's just sort of one example. all of our river systems are dumping things into the ocean. Farms, and you've got animals that urinate, well, that ends up in the ocean with antibiotics. We're seeing new parasites show up in the ocean. And this is putting stresses that start at the lowest level of the food chain, but ultimately get up into the tissues of marine mammals. Contaminants, PCBs, some of the fire retardant chemicals, they too are getting into the water system. And many of these things can't be treated in a sewage outfall. So that is indeed affecting animals. There is, I think, confusion about the role that toxins play in marine mammals. And certainly we hear about killer whales as though everything is a threat to them. In the case of contaminants, we know that females, as they grow, they're accumulating contaminants. But guess what happens when they give birth to the first calf? They transfer that contaminant load to their calf. And so they end up clean. The males, unfortunately, and particularly any firstborn males in this room, you accumulated all through your life and you got the worst dose from your mums if you were born first. Whereas females, by having calves in the killer whale population, they unload. We also know that it's not affecting the northern residents, which are increasing. So yes, it is a concern, but it's a concern throughout all levels of the food chain, but does not appear to be having a direct impact on killer whales.
And some studies in Puget Sound are really the best coverage I've seen yet. They've been looking at the effect of development in a number of their estuaries there on the Chinook populations returning to those rivers. And this has been a major program through the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And there is a direct relationship between the survival of Chinook in these systems and the extent of development in the estuaries. And some of this is directly related to various types of contaminants picked up in the water coming down and that. And of course, you can sample before the communities and after the communities. So there's no question that the contaminants are having an effect on, and they're contributing to poor marine survival of some Chinook populations. And that in Canada, we didn't do a direct study on that in the Salish Marine Survival Program. It is something now that we think probably should be a second phase in terms of looking at some of the different populations. And some populations coming down the Fraser River don't use the estuary much at all. The bigger spring Chinook that come down, they're already about 10 centimeters long. They go right out to sea. They go right through the estuary. But interestingly enough, the two populations that I identified are critically dependent on wetlands and marshes and estuaries as they come down as smaller Chinook. They grow in those areas for a short period of time before they go to sea. And so those are the populations that we think would be more likely to show effects of contaminants than Chinook, just as a broad comment on the species. All right, so I think that in the Salish Sea, particularly the Strait of Georgia, we probably really do have to go back and look in the lower Fraser River, which is a program that we're trying to get developed under the Ocean Protection Plan. Broader mammals to Andrew. Salmon are not very affected by noise. I mean, noise will, anybody that's been around docks, you can see it's any loud noise, the fish will immediately move, but as soon as the noise stops, and you're gonna see them back within a minute, sort of thing. So they will shift and come back and this sort of thing. So I think noise on fish is not a huge issue. Definitely if there's noise, the Chinook would avoid it, including the larger fish and that. So I think the real success in some of the recent work through the port has been reducing the rate of passage and the noise content. I'm sure that has to have some benefit to it. I mean, the tanker thing, I think, is more complex than people really seem to give it credit to. So the change in tankers that are coming in, these are going to be very slow-moving tankers. They're bigger boats that are going to be highly controlled by the pilots, and that I don't know that they're going to have any real net increase. I mean, the noise would, especially on newer vessels are much, much less noisy than the older vessels, particularly our wonderful ferries, right? But the net effect is what? It's about a 10 or 15% increase in vessel traffic.
No, it's far less than that. It's in 10 or 12% increase
12.
in tanker traffic increase.
Yeah.
The overall net is there's more than 12,000 ship movements on the coast here a year, and they're talking about increasing tanker traffic movement by a very small percentage of that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. You know, the public discussion about noise is focused on increase in tanker traffic, the 7-fold increase that's projected. But you're never told when you hear a percent increase like that, so what's the absolute number? And that's what people should be asking is, what's the denominator? Well, we're going from my understanding, from 2 vessels per week to 14, so an extra 12. No one bats an eyelash when BC Ferries announced on a long weekend they're going to add over 300 extra sailings. That is the biggest noisemaker in the Salish Sea. It's BC Ferries. And so if these groups truly cared about noise, they'd be saying, we want half as many sailings, we want them to go twice as slow, because we care about whales and this noise we just can't stand. Put a percentage onto that. And so I find a lot of the discussion is very hypocritical. It's not really getting at what the real issues are. And you know, the threat of being struck by a tanker that's going cautiously slow, well, it's BC Ferries you want to slow down, but they watch all the time, and they're extremely careful. And we're not seeing it. Remember, killer whales are the largest dolphin. They are an urbanized whale, and they're used to being in and around vessels. It doesn't mean that they can't be struck. It doesn't mean that they can't be cut by propellers. But there are many cases where the whales actively engage with vessels, wanting to ride their wakes, coming in very close, getting very close to the props. The whales have adapted. But the public discussion is focused on sevenfold without anybody asking the absolute numbers, or even asking, so who's really making the noise here? Maybe we need to build a bridge to Vancouver Island. Maybe we should ban all ferries, if that's what you truly believe is the cause of the trouble.
Living on the island, I don't believe anything he says. But, I mean, one of the things is the age of the vessels that can be serviced. I mean, we've talked about people loading these vessels before. There's a new fishery vessel being built for the West Coast. Not a good story right now, but actually the vessel will be built with a zero noise design, right? And so in the North Sea, the research vessels there have a zero noise limitation, right? Because of the hydroacoustic measure they're taking for all their assessments. So the vessels that are being built today are incredibly efficient for sound compared to what the older vessels are, and the maintenance of the older vessels and that sort of thing. So I'm quite sure that they'll make great progress on the sound aspect, but the number thing is definitely confused many times the way it's said. Well, let me start this time. Because in all honesty, Andrew referred to 2 workshops that had many of these exact same discussions, right? And as he said, it was all written up. This is the process where we're trying to advise policymakers, and it just isn't in the discussion, right? So there's only so much we can do. I mean, probably the best thing we can do is talk to groups like this about what's really going on, and you can spread it by word of mouth. But so far right now, the communication of all the science, and this will be the challenge under our Salish Sea program. How do we effectively get this information out, right? And we do spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But there's just not a willingness to hear some of this stuff. And so it is a really good question. How do we really make this happen? One of the things that we have a real opportunity for is we have a West Coast minister now, and we have a provincial government that's showing an interest in wild salmon. So I think it's like probably groups like ourselves, so the Marine Mammal Unit at UBC, PSF, because of supporting all this. One of the things that we have left in the Salish Sea program is we're actually we're writing 2 totally independent ecosystem-based models. So this will be the first time where we can really test our understanding by building these things to see, can we generate anything that looks like nature out there? Because then we can actually start manipulating things to see whether or not we can effectively restore Chinook for the benefit of orcas and recreational fishers. But we have to have a receptive audience. And that is still the challenge of the day in my mind.
And I'm really at a loss to know what to do. Every day I hear misinformation. When I see it in newspapers, I contact the reporters and say, you know, what you said isn't true. You need to fix this, here are the facts. There's usually this awkward silence, well, we can't do that. I said, yes, you can online. I know you can do that. I think you have an onus to get it right. So what I'm seeing on the media side is there are no wildlife experts. So we used to have Larry Pinn, who sort of specialized in writing stories about wildlife. He's retired. And now it's like open season. Every young reporter loves killer whales, and they're all different people writing stories, and they don't even know who the sources are. And there are now like 100 killer whale experts. People I've never heard of before are now the expert. They're spouting out opinions. And there's so much mass confusion that it's literally taken on a life of its own. And I don't know what to do to correct that. I sort of feel we're now caught up in the world of, fake science. And as long as you just repeat it often enough, it takes on a truth of its own. Where someone would see the numbers I showed you and say, well, how do you know those are the real data? Well, they are. Well, those are your data, but they imply there's somebody else's data. So it's a real mess. And I think even at the political level that they're hearing from constituents that are reading things and talking, and they all have created this narrative. And the simple narrative is killer whales are declining, they're starving, it's because of fishing. And what's going to really put them over the edge is being struck by tankers. And they see this as a very simple story, and you don't need science to back that one up. It just makes common sense. And so I don't know, I guess I would turn to you and ask for your suggestions of what to do. But even there's a film that's coming out this week on killer whales. I saw the preamble, and it's full of misinformation. It's full of emotion. They're starving. We got to do something, save them now. And millions of kids will get to watch this. And so these things are not factual, but they're very believable. And
So-
that's what we're dealing with.
So the producers of that movie got in touch with me saying, gee, we saw your interview with Andrew. How'd you like to have us on your show now? And I turned them down. Because I think that the consequence of all of this is that our governments will wind up making decisions that are based on false data. And we're living in a world right now where social license, which is not necessarily the people who have the correct information, are influencing the way that governments are setting policy and going around those agencies that have been created to make sound decisions and protect the environment that we need to cherish.
But I'm also concerned that, I show you the graphs of the data, and that's viewed as, that's just my opinion. It's not a fact, it's an opinion, and someone has a different opinion. We just happen to disagree. But no, this is not an opinion. This is a fact. These are the numbers. This is
And this
what we
happens
know.
with us too. I mean, the example of providing the state of salmon to the BC Wild Salmon Council. So they showed me the summary they were going to write, right? And it says in there, Dr. Riddle's personal opinion is the decline in sockeye salmon. Well, that's not an opinion in any way, right? It just didn't happen to jive with what they wanted to put in their document. And you can't allow this stuff, right? And so I said, you're not allowed to use our document if you incorporate that. And of course, that changed it right away. But 99 out of 100 times, I would never see a draft of a document of something that people are going to print. They just happen to feel that they wanted to show it to us. It's got nothing to do with opinions, right? I mean, of all things, scientists are trying to prevent the actual facts to it and let people make interpretations of it. And yes, we will interpret it, but this idea that, the false information out there, it's a very serious communication issue right now. And one of the reasons that we need to keep on education.
One last point on this.
You hit a hot button here, last thing, and then Mike's going to give us
Last point,
something.
there's a question down here I can see.
Do we have time, Mike?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We
yeah.
only get
We're going to
together.
keep it going then.
Couple
I was
times
once
a year.
invited to Washington, D.C. on a congressional hearing to testify. Well, I've been there a couple times, but on this one occasion, the congressman pointed to a fellow from the National Marine Fisheries Service who was sitting next to me, a government scientist. He points his finger and said, "Sir, do you believe in climate change?" And the poor guy couldn't say anything because he'd lose his job. And I was waiting to answer the question. And of course, he didn't ask me, but my answer was, climate change is not a belief, it's a fact. And yet we're dealing in a world where people interpret science to be beliefs and opinions and dismiss it as that. And that's really disturbing.
How about a round of applause for Stu McNish and Andrew Treitz and Brian Riddle? And Steve, thank you so much for kind of giving us a note to conclude on there. We've been doing this luncheon now for 6-7 years, and we videotape it, and we make sure that we get it out to everybody who can't be here. And that's what we ask you to do, is share it and make sure that those in your network and your community see, the good type of research that we're funding through PSF, but also that we get clarity of facts around these various issues. It's been a big part of our Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project to add real data to stuff that's been anecdotal for a long time, the things like the seal beanies and the amount of salmon that the whales are eating. So that's been a big contribution, I think, from Brian and the science work that we've been doing, and now we have to put it into play in action plans with the government. But anyways, let me say thank you to Stu with a small token of our appreciation, and to you, Andrew, as well. Brian, you get a paycheck, so nothing for you. But this is just a small thank you for taking the time to come here, and Andrew to put this presentation together. Stu for giving Andrew an amplification opportunity through Conversations That Matters. You've had Brian on before, and you're very sound, true journalist, and we thank you for all that you do on that front. So a round of applause for you folks, and then I'll make some closing remarks. And last but not least, it's getting to be charitable tax giving time, the end of the year. We have our big year-end appeal. I was hoping that Rudy was going to be here. He said he was going to be here, but Rudy North has annually for the last several years put up a matching challenge of $50,000. So if you make a donation to our year-end appeal, particularly early in the year-end appeal, you'll have the confidence of knowing that your donation is matched, thanks to Rudy North. Just to close, on behalf of our board and staff, to all of you, thank you very much for coming today, spending some time with us, for your support through the years. And we look very much over the course of 2019 to communicating more about our Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project and our action plans that we're going to be putting forward in the future. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.